Hello and welcome to the CDO Magazine interview series. I am Michael Fillios, founder and CEO of IT Ally and a CDO editorial board member. And we are partnering with CDO Magazine, MIT CDO IQ, and the International Society of Chief Data Officers in a series of interviews. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Subha Madhavan, Vice President and Head of Clinical AI and ML, Early Clinical Development at Pfizer. Subha, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Michael. Pleased to be here.
I'm very intrigued by your work at Georgetown University Medical Center, and where you led a team of R&D scientists and informaticians to advance computational big data science in clinical research and education. Given the different stakeholders and the strategies there, I'm curious about how you drove alignment and the mission of your clinical and academic partners, right? This is always a challenge in most companies, given different agendas and how you need to, rally around the shared mission and vision. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. I mean, I think partnership is key, right? So, one thing that our team learned sitting at Georgetown University, I mean, it's an academic institution, it's a research institution, and our primary goal is research and education. But on one hand, the Georgetown University Hospital, which is part of the university, is a member hospital of the larger MedStar Health Network in the greater Washington, D.C. area. So all of a sudden, here you've got stakeholders who are running hospitals, who are clinical experts, who are running patient lines and so on. And so, how do you drive consensus across all of these domains of education, research, and clinical care to impact patients, and at the same time also to advance research, right? So partnership is really key. Early on, we established data governance committees where you would have leaders from the university and leaders from the hospital network, which is actually a 10 hospital network in the greater Washington, D.C. area. They sat together in these governance bodies that would vet and review the priorities for how data science projects would happen, who do we give access to, whether it be internal partners or external partners. So I would emphasize that that's really key, is to drive early consensus across the different stakeholders. So one cool project that we worked on was this Cloud First initiative, right? So this was with Amazon Web Services back in the day, almost 7 or 8 years ago now, when they were organizing a sort of a consortium to figure out what type of clinical and research data can actually go on the cloud, right? So there are all kinds of issues, as you can envision, patient security issues, patient privacy issues. And I think here is where, taking a page out of, other domains and how, others are doing this in cybersecurity or in the financial sector to really gain the trust of people who are actually giving data. So in some ways, patients, we're responsible to patients who are actually literally donating their data for clinical research, and how can we be very careful about how this data is managed on the cloud. So, it took a few months through this governance body to establish those protocols that data and trust, and making sure that proper de-identification methodologies were put in place, proper data standardizations were put in place, and also how does one access data. There was a concierge service with the human in the loop. Not everything can be automated. And so the humans would literally kind of, run the queries, extract the data, work with the investigators to provision that patient data from the cloud to enable research. So that whole process, I would say, it took us about a year to work out all the kinks. But, at the end of the day, hundreds of researchers and thousands of patients benefit because this protocol was put in place. So again, that sort of brings me back to partnerships and making sure that we're not thinking about it after the fact, but literally getting all the stakeholders around the table and establishing policies up front was very helpful in this process.
Sure. Would you say that was, one of the challenges you had to overcome in that kind of?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And this is not a challenge that's just unique for Georgetown or for MedStar, right? So this is something that all of us have to deal with. And and there is a lot of sensitivity around patient data, and we live in a highly regulated industry. So this is where I think taking a page out of the book of, how other domains are doing this can really help inform. And, we've come a long way. I think there's a lot of progress in terms of, safely and securely and being good stewards of data, being able to share this data for secondary use beyond what it's collected for.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of your colleagues that are in leadership positions around data often are talking about data governance and some of the challenges around it. So I'd love to maybe drill down a little bit more on this topic because I know it's of interest to many of our listeners. So when you think about managing data across multiple functional areas or different business units or departments and whatnot, what have you seen in terms of maybe best practices or things that work for you in trying to drive data governance in these kinds of settings?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. It's always, so the way I think about this is it's on an as needed basis, right? So so one way to think about this is, let's organize all of the data and the different functions will have access to this this large ecosystem of data sets, and lots of talks about centralized versus federated, a lot of technologies that are available. But the other approach, in which I have always focused on, throughout my career, is provisioning data on an as-needed basis, right? So I think that works out really well. You do want the technical teams who have a full handle on the entire data ecosystem, but then you have the data governance team members who are actually provisioning data once there is a clear justification, right? So I'll give you an example. So this actually is a classic example from Georgetown University. We were working on a breast cancer data set. There was a team that managed real world evidence data, right? So the RWE data sets, which are coming from care databases, electronic medical records, claims data, and so on. And then there was a research team that was managing all of the molecular data and the research data sets from patient biopsies, et cetera. And then we had sort of another team, which was mostly sort of, epidemiology and public health focused, that was looking at larger public health type of information. So we had projects that had to interconnect data sets from across these different functions. And what we did was we established a very simple kind of a data request form. And it was just 7 or 8 things. They would say, okay, here is a question we're trying to answer. Here is a justification for accessing this data. And here are the investigators that we're collaborating with. And then that form would go to the governance committee, and we had established a 24-hour turnaround to give information back to the investigator, whether or not this was going to be feasible. 24 to 48 hours is what we ultimately settled on, so that there was always a team that was catching these requests and talking to these 3 teams to quickly assess feasibility and whether or not this is even going to be possible for us to run this data. We ran over hundreds of projects through this mechanism, right? And the same data request form that provisioned data from across these 3 different functions, and investigators would come in and provision. So I always think of that as a sort of a success story. I mean, was it a success right off the bat? Absolutely not, right? So there were lots of challenges. What were the data elements that we want to capture from investigators? What level of detail? How do we make sure that we can resource these data requests? And I think once we started responding to these data requests and people started writing papers and they got grants out of this data that they were pulling from, that we were able to provision, then we were easily able to justify to the leadership that we need to add a couple more people to run the queries on these databases. So it was sort of a start small, but grow based on what the needs of the organizations were. And I think that process really worked well for us from a data governance and also an execution perspective.
Understood. So, I love to talk to our guests that are especially coming from larger, organizations, to get their perspective on, if you were an SMB, a small, medium-sized business, what advice would you give to a business executive that's looking to leverage data in their entities? And this is a focus, of course, of mine as a part of the CDO editorial board, but also working with small and mid-sized businesses every day. One of the things that, of course, you can argue is that Pfizer's got a tremendous amount of resources, both financial and people, but the technologies that are being leveraged are made available to everyone today. So it sort of levels the playing field for a small business even to have access to AI and ML and these kinds of things. So always curious to understand, from leaders like yourself, how and what advice you would give to a smaller business that's maybe looking to take advantage of these capabilities and to see how they would, derive some benefits from it.
Yeah, I would address that, from my vantage point of having advised small businesses throughout my career. I also was part of a team of a small business company that was providing precision medicine services. And you're exactly right. A lot of these technologies now are almost commodities, right? So, if you have terabytes of data, you don't need a data center anymore. I mean, the cloud can help you provision that. If you need sort of automation tools, there are lots of companies that provide those automation tools, for example. One sort of advice I always give to my small business partners is find your anchor clients and your use cases, right? So yes, it's about the data and the tools, but if those are becoming more commoditized, you go after the clear clinical questions or whatever the business questions that you're trying to answer. And you can do that by having close partnerships with, I would say just even one or two anchor clients that would help you clarify those initial use cases, right? So that's point number one. Point number two is, develop an expertise in an area, like being known for that particular domain or your technology, right? So, knowledge graphs is a classic example. A lot of companies are trying to build knowledge graphs to connect entities and relationships across multiple domains. This is a classic way of trying to understand and infer new relationships that we don't already know, right? So one good example is Facebook, right? So I can actually, using Facebook's knowledge graph, we can now find other friends, my friends of friends, right? Mm-hmm. So it helps me traverse that relationship to find what I want. And you can literally apply that to the clinical domain or the life sciences domain to understand relationships between genes and drugs and diseases. So if you're a knowledge graph expert, try to become well known in that particular capacity, and then you're servicing multiple domain areas with that. So clearly, those would be my advice. I mean, finding those anchor clients and really, being well known in a particular area. And also have to be, last thing I would say is, you have to somewhat be opportunistic, right? So, okay, you have a small business and you're trying to establish a business in a certain area, either products or you're building products or providing services, but also be willing to pivot because the world is moving so rapidly now. I mean, we didn't have to solve a global pandemic 2 years ago, but now here we are, right? So how do you, have that nimbleness and be agile and be opportunistic about aligning your business goals with what needs to be solved immediately? I think those would be my 3 pointers to my small business colleagues.
Awesome. I think that's a great place to stop. I know we can go on much further with all the knowledge that you have, but I'd like to thank you for joining me today, Subha. And to learn more about CDO Magazine or to view more interviews, please visit cdomagazine.tech. Thank you very much.